Here we go. All right. So we're going to start off here. This again is going to be a series about the gear, or some may say convert. We're going to talk a little bit about that concept and just a number of things here. Um, so we'll just kind of dive in and go. So um, here it is. HaGer, right? To proselytize or not to proselytize? This is a pretty big question. The question started back in, well, before the coming of the Messiah. There was a whole debate within Judaism. Do we share our faith? Do we make converts? And what does it mean to be a convert anyway? And then that carried forth over into Christianity. So at the time of the apostles, the big question was, um, what do us Jews, or what do us Israelites, what do we do with these Gentiles? These Gentiles that now believe, what do we do with them, right? I mean, Acts 15 records a whole big meeting where all the main players get together and say, what do we do with these Gentiles? And it's kind of interesting, about 2,000 years later, you have the rise of the Catholic Church and it's splintering into all this whole Protestant faith and evangelicals and all these denominations, and they come along and they say, what do we do with these Jews? What do we do with these Jews? These Jews need to become Christians? Now, do they need to start doing things our way? Do they stay doing things their way? And you have just such a vast array of opinion on the matter, and a lot of it falls into the realm of subjectivity too. A lot of it just says, well, I think, very little of it says, well, the Bible says. A lot of it comes down into subjective, or a lot of it from the Christian sense, it's like, well, these are our doctrines, right? And so we have these doctrines about the works of the law, and so we have these doctrines about this and doctrines of that. And then some people just say, well, no, the Jews should just stay Jews. They should remain Jews and do their thing, and we Gentiles should do our own thing, and so on and so forth. And it's seems awfully convoluted. So this is the question. So first, deal a little bit with the topic of conversion. What is conversion? So here's a simple definition from Webster's dictionary. It says, the act or process of changing from one form, state, etc. to another. That's pretty simple, right? The act or process of changing from one religion, belief, political party, etc. to another. Okay? And those definitions basically play off one another. I mean, really, you could end up with the first definition. You're in one religion, that's one state. You go to another religion, that's another state. Or you could say you go from no religion to another state. But truth be told, most people have some form of religion, even those that claim to be anti-religion. It's just not organized. Most of what we call science today is without question a religion. It has its dogmas and its procedures and its formulas and its rituals and its statements of faith and its belief system. And in fact, if you don't fall into that, there are scientists that get kicked out of the scientific community because their beliefs don't line up. I mean, that almost sounds like church, right? Funny but true. Okay, so to continue this line of thought about conversion, what I want to share with you, this is actually from Chabad, and I'm going to show some different things from different web sources and stuff as I go through this, but I don't want anyone to come away with and think that what I'm building off of here is just from Wikipedia, for example. No, this is actually a lot of research over a number of years, over a lot of sources, from the Talmud to other collections of Midrash to encyclopedias, both written and online, as well as searching through the original language in the Hebrew and Aramaic and so on and so forth. So I'm just distilling it and using these sources to simplify some of that information. And also these are sources that anybody can find themselves. So there was a question written to a rabbi at Chabad. And the question was essentially, why is conversion to Judaism so hard? And I liked some of the things from his answer here, and I thought it'd be good to share them and then to help explain or build upon the ideas that he expresses here. Okay. So it says, religion, after all, is all about belief. If you believe, you're in. If not, you're out. So why can't anyone who believes in the Jewish religion be considered Jewish? And why are those who don't believe and don't keep any of the Jewish practice still considered Jews? That's what happens when you view the Jewish people through another people's lexicon. It all looks very puzzling. What though if we look at ourselves through our own language, through the original Hebrew? That's a pretty novel thought, right? What if we use our dictionary? Could you imagine trying to understand some signs or things that are written in English, but you go and you pull a Spanish dictionary or Japanese dictionary, and you're trying to figure out what this sign is telling you or what this building is? It wouldn't work. So it says, we'll start with the word religion. Is Judaism a religion? Is that the right word? Religions generally start when one teacher spreads his teaching to many disciples. The people who accept these teachings are considered co-religionists. Their common beliefs hold them together as a community. So in other words, everybody that hears these teachings and agree to it, and they say, well, we all agree to it, so we're all kind of in this together, right? And so we're of this religion. We all share this faith. And on the surface, okay, for believers in Yeshua, on the surface, it almost seems like, well, yeah, but isn't that what, the gospel was? Isn't that? I'm going to tell you, no, it's not. It's not. Yeshua was not a guru. He was not a guru giving some great insight based on some spiritual wisdom that he uncovered by looking within himself, by staring at the trees, by looking at a rock, by studying nature, or listening to the sound of a waterfall, or any other kinds of things that religions have sprouted up based off of. Yeshua comes and he says he came from God, the God of Abraham, not just any God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yeshua was a Jew. He already had an existing faith and a people around that faith. This is different. Yeshua didn't come in and say, well, I've found a truth of God separate from the previously revealed truth about God. Now follow me. Stop following this. So that's why when you read that, some people may think, well, yeah, but that's what happened. Isn't that what Christianity is? That's not what it started as. So it says, Moses didn't preach a religion to individuals. He was more of a populist, a civil rights leader who stood for empowerment of the people. He took his own people who already had a common heritage, along with many who had decided to join that people, and brought them to Mount Sinai. There he brokered a covenant between a nation and God. God said, I choose this nation to be my messenger of Torah light to the world. The nation in turn chose God, saying, whatever God says, we will do, and we will obey. In other words, a religion wasn't being revealed to this people. A nation and laws that govern this nation were being revealed. So, and again, there's a covenant there, which is also really important to understand. So it's not just a nation, but it's a nation with an agreement, and a nation with a purpose, and a nation with an accountability to another party. In other words, these people weren't forming this nation themselves. Another party was actually saying, I desire this nation to be formed. Will you be the willing participants to form it? And through that agreement, Israel as a nation, not as a people, is born. It's really important because, again, once we understand that Moses didn't come to form a nation, then we can understand too that a religion, Moses came to form a nation, not a religion. Then we can understand too, Yeshua came about a nation and not to start a religion. Yeshua wasn't trying to start a religion. He was dealing with a nation. In fact, some of the things it talks about here about Moses being a populist and a civil rights leader, when you look at the things Yeshua says, you will find that he too was much in the same way. Because what? He was rebuking the people on how they were handling the laws of the nation, right? And so he wasn't rebuking people about religious practices, even though the religion and the nation are one and the same, but there's also the national aspect. It's not just simply a religion. It says the Jewish people then are at best described as the people of the covenant, meaning that they're a people because of a covenant. In Hebrew, a covenant is a brit. In this case, not a brit between two individuals or between an individual and God as Abraham had made, but a brit between an entire nation and God. A covenant, you see, is a two-way deal. It takes two to make it and two to break it. Just because the people have let it go doesn't mean God has. And that's why it's called an eternal covenant, because even if the people may be fickle, God doesn't change his mind. So in other words, even if the people break their end of the covenant, if God doesn't release them or doesn't break his end of the covenant can still stand. It just needs to be mended, but it can still stand. It's not like a typical contract that may be set up today where if one person's in breach of contract, the contract dissolves. No, this takes actually both parties to release others. And there's contracts like that today. There's contracts like that today where you may be in breach of contract, but the contract still stands because it requires some other instance for it to be dissolved. And so that's how it is with God. So it's not just about saying, well, I like the ideas of this book, or I like what these people think. I just accept them, and then that automatically makes me a member of the community. That's not exactly how it works. There's elements of that there, but there's a little bit more to it because you're not just joining a religion like you join a club. It's not like getting a gym membership, right? And then after a while you say, well, I don't really like this gym that much. The gym down the street's actually a little better. I'm just going to cancel my membership and go over there. Once you come into a covenant with God, you just can't just leave it. It just doesn't work that way. You're in. You may no longer be going along with the things that God said. You may be disobedient. You may be acting as a wicked person, but you're in. You're a member now. You know, it's it's more akin to like a street gang or something. You know, you get in, you're in for life. You know, the only way out is death. It's kind of the way it is. And that may kind of freak people out, but it's kind of the way it is. You know, it's marriage. That's how marriage used to be. It's not so much today, but it's how marriage used to be. You came in, you joined the covenant. One person doesn't want to be. Well, you just, you know, it's till death do you part. You don't really. You're married. You're in. You know, it's like you get the tattoo. You got a tattoo. You know, it's there. It doesn't just go. You know, so that's how it is. That's how it is with this faith. It's not joining a club. It's entering into a contract, so to speak. It's more than a contract, but that's just easy language to use. And once you're in, you're in. You may find later on down the road, you say, well, I reject all that, and I reject that God, and I'm not going to do any of this stuff anymore. Well, that's great. And if you can convince yourself that he's a figment of imagination, you can go along and live your life whatever you want. But for those of us that believe he's real, know that your rejection of him doesn't absolve you from penalty or consequence or anything else. And so there will be a day of reckoning for your behavior. So you can go around and lie to yourself for as long as you want. As far as he's concerned, you're still a part of his. He's got to release you from that. Okay. So I talked a little bit about some of this stuff already. Jew, Christian, Israelite, Gentile. You know, what are we? You know, the issue of identity is one of the single greatest issues in Christianity. And it's certainly also an issue in Judaism as well, and I talked a little bit about this. um, that is, what do we do with Jews? What do Jews do with Gentiles? How does this faith work? What is, who are we? There's many that go around within Christianity and they want to be very proud and they want to say, I'm not a Jew. I'm not doing any Jewish things. I'm a Christian. I'm a Gentile, and I'm going to remain a Gentile, right? And without really realizing what they're saying. Because again, from a scriptural standpoint, there's a day of judgment planned for the nations. And that word Gentile in Hebrew is goy. And that word goy in Hebrew is translated as nations. Goyim is the nations. When you go around saying you're a Gentile, you're going around identifying yourself as a goyim, as the nations. And if you're of the nations, you're not of the nation, which is Israel. And those that are not of Israel are under judgment. Now, you may say, well, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer in the New Testament. And you say that in the New Testament it talks about and mentions Gentiles. Yes, it does, but you need to understand the way it's being used and what what is being meant. There's a lot of reasoning for it, and it's not just so simple as it may seem on the surface, and it'll take a long time to go through and help relate that understanding. And we're not going to be able to deal with that all here, and certainly not all today, but just understand that it's not ignoring those scriptures, okay? It's taking those into account, but we're just not dealing with that aspect right now. So Christianity has approximately 30 to 40,000 denominations, depending on how you define the word. So you have thousands, possibly tens of thousands of different views of what a Christian is, for starters. And then in Judaism, has three primary groups: Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist. And a lot of times that's really promoted how united Judaism is. Well, however, when you get deeper, you'll find there's much more. There's Chabad, Labav, Ultra-Orthodox, and that's ignoring other groups like Karaite Judaism, and so on. So there's a wide view of things in Judaism as well. And so where do you stand in some of that? What does it mean to follow this God? Right. So there's some terms used throughout the New Testament. And again, in time we're going to build on layers of thought. So there's these phrases, God-fears, okay, and that was a term definitely used in the first century. We know that. It's definitely used in the New Testament. Then there's ger toshav and ger ziddiq. Okay, these strange terms define and relate a complete lack of understanding that Christianity has about its faith, and are terms and ideas that have been corrupted to one degree or another from the rabbinic side of Judaism. So to return to our source and gain the faith that was once delivered by the prophets and apostles, we need to understand these things from a first century perspective. Right? I mean, if you believe in Yeshua and you're a Christian, you believe the New Testament, it's no small statement to say that the first century was the closest to the actual teachings of the Messiah. The further you get away from that, you get maybe a little bit of Chinese telephone. You're going to get a little further away from that truth. So if we want to understand the faith that they had, right, then we need to look at it from a perspective as close to that source as possible, and that's the first century. So the modern notions and ideas are not without merit to one degree or another, but they are largely irrelevant to how things were done at the beginning of the movement started by our Mashiach, right, the Christ. The New Testament, or Brit Hadashah, talks about both ones called God-fearers and proselytes. While some may disagree with my proposition, I believe the context of the usage differentiates the two. And I may explain a little bit more of that later. But essentially, my point, and there are others that view it this way, you can search it out, that God-fearers, that term, the way it's used mostly in the New Testament, echoes the way it would have been used in the first century, which is referring to what you'd call a half-proselyte, or a ger hasha'ar, a gate proselyte, or ger toshav, both the same Hebrew phrase. And then a proselyte would be, strictly speaking, more likely a reference to a ger ziddiq, a righteous proselyte. And I'm going to explain those terms a little bit more in a bit. But these terms, maybe some people have never heard them before. Say, what is a ger? A ger is the Hebrew word for the Greek word proselyte. Yeah, we'll touch about that more in a little bit. So what is a ger? There are two kinds of proselytes in Rabbinic Judaism. This comes from, I believe this comes from the Jewish Encyclopedia, the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia. There are two kinds of proselytes in Rabbinic Judaism: ger ziddiq, a righteous proselyte, proselytes of righteousness, religious proselytes, devout proselytes, and ger toshav, a resident proselyte, a proselytes of the gate, a limited proselyte, and a half proselyte. So this isn't just modern Judaism, or this isn't just a modern viewpoint. This is actually what the belief system of the first century, what's going on. So when you see things in the book of Acts in particular, this mindset is what's going on there. So a righteous proselyte is a Gentile who has converted to Judaism, is bound to all the doctrines and precepts of the Jewish religion, and is considered a full member of the Jewish people. And by that, don't take that so strictly. By that we mean the nation of Israel, the Jewish people as a form of being the visible aspect of that nation today. So the proselyte is circumcised as an adult, and if male, and immerses in a mikveh to formally effect the conversion. A gate proselyte is a resident alien who lives in the land of Israel and follows some of the customs. They are not required to be circumcised nor to comply with the whole Torah. They are bound only to conform to the 7 laws of Noah. Do not worship idols, do not blaspheme God's name, do not murder, do not commit fornication, immoral sexual acts, do not steal, do not tear a limb from a living animal, and do not fail to establish a rule of law, to be assured in the place of the world to come. Now, a couple things about this definition of gate proselyte. Like I said, this comes from the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, and as I mentioned, there is some layer of corruption here on the Jewish side of things. Mainly the 7 laws of Noah, which I'm not going to get much into today. On another day I will, and kind of talk and explain a little bit how to understand them, where they come from, and where they are. What I want to say right now, and you can check it out and verify it, and that's the 7 laws of Noah were not something that was binding in the first century. In other words, there wasn't a decision from the Sanhedrin at the time that said, nope, the 7 laws of Noah are what we consider binding on the whole world. There was much disagreement, and the 7 laws of Noah likely were not solidly codified even in the first century. They were something that were mainly later codified in the following centuries. Okay, and so we'll definitely talk about that more later. So when this says that a gate proselyte was one who lives in the land, that was not necessarily true, especially from a historical standpoint. There would have been many called gate proselytes or ger toshav who lived in the dispersion as well. There were many Gentile peoples in Babylon who had Jewish neighbors and lived near Jewish communities and who had faith in this God and attended their synagogues. The same thing as well as in the Greek lands, out in Alexandria, for instance, and many of the different places that in Antioch and different places that Paul traveled, there were many Gentiles who were attending synagogues and so on and so forth. And so they would have been considered God-fearers or ger toshav in those areas, and so they were not living in the land. So that, if we believe the New Testament records, then that's a false statement. Okay, in modern times, this comes from judaism.about.com. It says, in modern times, then, a ger is a convert, not merely a resident of the land in which the Jew resides. On a more technical level, there is a complication about when exactly one is a ger. The nature of conversions mean that the individual is now a full-fledged Jew with the same commitments as one who's born Jewish. The status of the ger, therefore, is considered to be the interim between being a non-Jew and a Jew when one is learning, observing the commandments and holidays, and living within the Jewish framework while pursuing a formal conversion. In short, a ger is the individual who is a convert in process. Further, a female is referred to as a geriot or geroret, and a male is a ger. Okay, so again, this comes from Jewish sources. It's not Christian sources. This isn't just stuff made up. But if you search it out, you'll find the same thing. That from a biblical, not just a Jewish standpoint, but from a biblical standpoint, the notion is a ger is a Gentile who has rejected his Gentile ways and is in the process of what would be full conversion. In other words, he is not entirely obligated to live his life in exactly the same manner as a Jew, but he is obligated to be in the process of learning that lifestyle and committing to that lifestyle to follow God. And this is what was going on in the first century. Now, it's very easy for people to have a knee-jerk reaction and start going, well, Paul says this and Paul says that, and what about the council in Jerusalem, and what about, circumcision being nothing, and these sorts of things. These are all very true statements by Paul. These statements are not being ignored in favor of this. What I'm saying is this layer of belief would have been prevalent at the time of Paul and actually influences Paul's writing more than people realize. Because if you just do a surface summary study of some of this stuff, or if you just look at things a little bit, you may not fully understand. That's the thing. You can't just look at a lot of this stuff on the surface and think that you fully understand some of the discussions, some of the arguments, some of the debates that are going on in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, and through Paul's writings. It's just not that simple. So what I'm going to tell you is that my belief, and I can verify it in time and with patience, that Paul was operating entirely within his faith to say the things that he says, and in fact the things that he says actually are said by others in Judaism, some and many of which did not even believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. So the word, here's some verses, okay, that I'm going to get into, and they deal primarily with a couple of these words. So some of you may think, well, the word ger, it doesn't even talk about ger in the New Testament. No, it absolutely 100% does. You got a layer hiding it called Greek, the Greek language, and then you got even another layer hiding it even more, and that's called the English language. And so actually the New Testament talks much the same way as you'll find in the writings of the Talmud and other Jewish sources. It's just covered up in the English language. So the word ger actually appears under its cognate proselyte in the Greek New Testament. In the Aramaic New Testament, the word geura, which is equivalent to the Hebrew ger, appears 4 times in the Aramaic New Testament. And there's other ways of saying ger that we can go through. I'm just not going to go through them at this time, but there are other words that relate. Then the Greek cognate proselyte appears 4 times in the exact same places as in the Aramaic New Testament. And the Hebrew word toshav in many instances is a synonym for the word ger. Not always. There are times when toshav isn't referring to a ger. In time we will deal with a lot of that, how to tell. But many times the word toshav, which means sojourner, does mean ger, or is referring to a ger, and it appears as the Aramaic word tautava 8 times in the New Testament. Now, of those 8 times, not all of those 8 times is it referring to a ger, but we're going to go through some verses here briefly just to show the ger in the New Testament. And then we'll build on a lot of these ideas in time later on. So Matthew 23:15, it says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you encompass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him 2-fold more a child of hell than yourselves." So, real interesting. So here, this is Yeshua, and he's talking about the scribes and Pharisees and how they travel all this distance and make one proselyte. Well, that's that word ger. So he's saying they're making a ger, right? A proselyte, a convert. This is a Gentile coming to their faith. And when he's made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Now, Yeshua isn't saying, nowhere in his rebuke is, don't do this. Don't make ger. Don't make proselytes. Or you traverse land and sea to make one proselyte, which you shouldn't do, and then when you do it, you make him two more full the child of hell than yourself. No, he's saying you expend all this effort, and then you make him twofold more of a child of hell than yourselves. And we need to understand, is he saying that because they're following the Torah? No. If that's true, then in another place when a young man comes to Yeshua and he says, good sir, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Yeshua responds to him, keep the commandments. If Yeshua's point here was, he's a son of hell because you're making him follow the Torah, then obviously he wouldn't have said that to the young man, right? He wouldn't tell him, keep the commandments if you want to inherit eternal life. No, the issues is some of their interpretations of the Torah and some of their oral laws were being brought into question. Because as we talked about earlier, Yeshua was what? He was an activist. Now don't take that too literally, but he was someone working within his faith, within his nation, to bring reform to his nation, to bring restoration to his nation because it was going off course. He wasn't someone coming in and saying, I have a new enlightenment. I have a new religious practice that I've been enlightened to, and I want to share it with these people and lead them in a new path. So Acts 2:8-10 says, and how we hear every man in our own tongue where we were born, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia and in Judea and Cappadocia, in Pontus and in Asia and Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt and parts of Libya and about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Jews and ger. So here's the ger again in the New Testament. Acts 6:5 says, and the sayings pleased the whole multitude, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Ghost, and Philip and Prochorus and Nicanor and Timon and Parmenas and Nicholas, a proselyte or ger of Antioch. So this guy Nicholas, which there's a lot we could say about him another time, was a ger. Now what type of ger was Nicholas? That's a whole other topic because I haven't dealt with it that much up to this point. The word ger again can be referencing one of two categories of ger. It could be referring to the ger toshav, a convert in progress, or ger ziddiq, which is a full convert. Principally speaking, you'd say a circumcised convert. In not all cases was someone considered, it wasn't universally true that someone couldn't be considered a ger ziddiq until he was circumcised. There were people that were considered ger ziddiq who were not circumcised, but principally speaking, when we talk about a ger ziddiq, we're talking about a circumcised convert, and a ger toshav, we're talking about an uncircumcised convert or someone in progress. So whether Nicholas was a ger toshav or ger ziddiq, it's unclear, but by implication I would say he was a ger ziddiq. He was probably a circumcised convert just based on the conventions of the day and the fact that the house of Shammai was ruling at the time. Acts 13:43 says, now when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who speaking to them persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. Now it's very interesting that it translates it that way. Not to be dogmatic about this, but I'm going to go back here. Oops, too far. Okay, so it says of a ger ziddiq, a righteous proselyte, right? Oops. Hang on. Sorry. Where am I? Here I am. One of the names for a Gerzitic is a devout proselyte, right? So when we go back here, sometimes it says religious, devout. So the fact that it says religious proselytes followed Paul, it's likely referring to Gerzitic here, most likely. Can we say that with 100% certainty? No, we can't. But it's likely that that's referring to. These were Gentiles who were circumcised and adhered. Now, maybe some of them weren't. Again, I can't prove it 100% one way or the other, just by implications of the words used. Okay, so they followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. So in other words, they followed him, and these were Jews and religious proselytes, and he didn't say, stop everything you're doing, do something new. He says, no, continue in the grace of God. Prior to this, he did talk to them about Yeshua being the Mashiach, and he talked about the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai, and he related that whole story, and he talked about the deliverer, but nowhere in that discourse does he say, flee these synagogues, flee these Jewish ways, or any sort of things. And in fact, when these people followed him to hear more, he said, continue in the grace of God, keep doing what you're doing. Right? Interesting. Acts 13:17 says, the God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers. That is Toshav, right? But by implication, Ger in the land of Egypt. And with a high arm, he brought them out of it. So earlier in Acts 13, this is Paul's exhortation to the people after the reading of the law and the prophets. And he talks about them dwelling as strangers. Now, in the Aramaic New Testament and in the Greek side of the New Testament, basically the word being used there is equal to the Hebrew word toshav. But I put Ger there also so you would understand that actually when you look at the Hebrew text, when you look back at Exodus and Genesis, where it talks about them going into Egypt and dwelling there, the actual Hebrew text calls them Ger. Says that the Israelites were Ger in Egypt. Okay, they were dwelling in a land not their own. That by default makes them Ger, that they were Gerim in Egypt. Hebrews 11:13 says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers. In Aramaic, that's exenaya, and pilgrims, and that's Toshav, right, on the earth. And again, when we look back at Genesis, Exodus, and so on, when the scripture talks about the people being strangers and pilgrims, your English Bibles may translate it that way, but in Hebrew, it's Ger Toshav, and Hebrews 11:13 is definitely drawing on that same language. So it's identifying that these people were Ger Toshav. Now, that's a little bit more complicated to get into. You can't really get into that in a very short amount of time. Because again, when we talk about Ger Toshav and we talk about it being a proselyte in progress or convert in progress, there's deeper ideas related through the idea of the Ger. So Israel as a whole is considered Ger in the sense that the land that we live in, this earth, is not our home. We look forward to a new heaven and earth, a renewed heaven and earth. We call that Olam Haba, or the world that is to come, and that is our home. So while we're not in that period of time yet, we are there's that idea of a universal Ger. Okay, there's a universal Ger in the sense that all of God's children are dwelling in a strange land because this land is foreign. It acts in a way contrary to God. We don't live in a world that is all where the knowledge of God blankets it like the sea, right? Or that everybody has knowledge of the holy and everybody follows his ways. We don't live in that time period yet. So in that sense, we're Ger. But there's another sense of the word ger, which is someone entering into the kingdom of Israel, which is the people that are pursuing that future world. Okay, then we have 1 Peter 1:1. It says, Peter, an apostle of Yeshua Mashiach, or Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered through Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And again, that's Toshav, but it's in reference to the Gerim there, the people that were scattered abroad, right, to those living in the exile. So that could include believing Jews and believing Gentiles as well. But that's who Peter's writing to in that letter. So he's writing to the Gerim there. So again, this whole idea is probably new to many people who never heard any of this stuff before. And so when they read Peter's letter, they don't know specifically who he's addressing or what the context is even speaking about. Peter writes again in 1 Peter 2:11, it says, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers, that's exneia, and pilgrims, toshav, which is actually tautava. And again, it's that phrase, ger toshav, right? When they're used together like that in the Hebrew segment of the scriptures, many people call the Old Testament, when you look at Genesis, where it's first used, when you look at Exodus and so on, where it's used, stranger and pilgrim put together, is underneath that is the Hebrew words ger toshav. And so as ger toshav, right, proselytes, converts in progress, abstain from fleshy lusts which war against your soul. Now, it's not that Jews don't need to abstain from fleshy lusts that war against their soul, but by and large, if they grew up in a religious household, they already know this. But as a Gentile who are coming to learn about this God and learn about this faith, you would need that sort of exhortation because you don't know. So it would make sense for Peter to say, hey, beloved, you ger toshav, you people who are coming to learn this faith, you're converts in progress, remember to abstain from the fleshy lusts because they war against your soul. Right? So that's by and large a quick overview just from the New Testament. You know, this isn't going through all the rest of the scriptures and seeing how these phrases are used, and there's a lot of learning to be done from there, and there's just a lot more work to be done to explain these ideas and to help with the identity issues and to help us understand our roles and our obligations when we come to this faith. You believe in Yeshua. You know, by and large, many people in mass are being presented this idea of this religion. I'm of a Christian religion. I believe in Yeshua. And they're lacking the notions. You know, in Judaism, when you convert to Judaism, it's understood that you're joining a nation. You're joining a people. In fact, in Islam, how many of you know Islam is a nation? It's a nation without borders. It's a nation without walls. That when a person becomes a Muslim, they are understanding that they're a part of the Muslim or the Islamic nation, the nation of Islam, right? But with Christians, you're joining a religion. No, that's not. And if that's not what you signed up for as a person, then you may need to think about that. And you may need to analyze it because you may have a chance to get out if you haven't really entered into the covenant with your Creator. If you want to flee because you're afraid of that responsibility, then by all means you should flee. But otherwise, you know, that's the reality. So the reality is, you know, and if maybe you haven't reached a point to where you've entered into that covenant, but you want to continue and you want to pursue, understand what you're getting into and what you're signing up for. And what you're signing up for, you can choose to mentally reject later, but you don't leave it. You just can't just leave it. You may be identified as a wicked person within that nation, and you may suffer consequences and eventual rejection by that nation, including an eternal sentence. That's a real possibility, but you don't just leave it. You don't just, it doesn't, it's not something you put on or off like a religious garment. So that's about where we're at and where we'll close here. So hopefully a lot of that made sense. Again, we'll build on ideas later on in later time, just trying to record some of this stuff, especially because around here a lot of times we end up repeating things and so on and so forth. So it makes it easier to record some of the stuff and so that it can be referenced later without having to go in depth every time. So that's where we're